Okay, great. Hi, everybody, and welcome today for our talk on immigration and FOIA. My name is Anna Flagg, and I'm a data reporter at the Marshall Project. And I'm super happy to be able to welcome our three panelists here today, who are all experts in the work of requesting and obtaining immigration data and analyzing that data to find and tell stories. So if you've been following immigration, probably many of you are already familiar with the work of these really great reporters. We have with us Melissa Lewis, a data reporter for Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting. Melissa covers criminal legal systems, including the US immigration system. And you might have seen her report last fall about migrant children being held in government custody at ORR shelters. A shocking number of kids have spent long times in custody there. And in the last 6 years, over 25,000 kids were held for prolonged periods of time, lasting 100 days or more. In addition to Melissa's reporting work, she's also a leader in the Portland chapter of the Asian American Journalists Association and the PyLadies Portland group of women Python programmers. So welcome, Melissa. Great to have you with us. We also have Tanvi Misra. She is an independent reporter covering immigration as well as the criminal justice system, economic inequality, and urban policy. Her immigration work covers many aspects of the US immigration system, including the effects of federal policy decisions, the Trump immigration agenda and dysfunction within policy implementation, conditions in immigrant detention, safety and medical crises in custody, the immigration courts, and many others. During the Trump administration, she used contract data obtained via FOIA to show that local governments were collaborating with ICE to detain immigrants in local facilities. And this happened in many areas, including liberal jurisdictions and even some cities that were known as sanctuary cities, all with shockingly little oversight over the treatment of the people being held. So thanks so much to you two, Tanvi, for joining us to discuss some of this really interesting work. And we have Andrew Calderon, who is my teammate here at the Marshall Project. He's a data reporter focused on the US immigration system. And he's the Marshall Project's sole data reporter who is specifically devoted to immigration. And so he's just done a ton of work reporting out the mechanics of the various immigration agencies and data systems, obtaining immigration data using a range of creative data collection methods, and analyzing and visualizing that data to drive some of our most important immigration stories. Towards the end of the Trump administration, Andrew collaborated with a team here at Marshall to create an ambitious multimedia visual history of the US immigration system, showing how it has become this kind of vast carceral system that it is today. The data here was crucial to understanding the evolution of immigrant detention, with Andrew's work in particular showing that over the last 40 years, the population of immigrants being detained has grown by over 20-fold. So thank you to Andrew for taking the time to join us. Okay, so those are our panelists and we can get started now. Yeah, just note that we wanted to kind of be as responsive as possible to your questions from the audience. So as much as we can, we're gonna focus on the questions that you guys submit. So feel free to send us your questions. And I'll just kick things off with something that I know is, I mean, this is often a struggle in reporting on the immigration system, like the challenge of unraveling all the interconnected kind of agencies that are responsible for holding up different parts of the immigration processing and detention, and understanding the data that they report as opposed to the data that's available from other sources. So Tanvi, maybe you can get us started here. Tell us a little bit about where you found useful data and any tips you have for kind of navigating the data universe here.
Thanks so much for having me. So I've, like you said, there's just a really complex mix of agencies and federal and local governments that, work on immigration enforcement and detention. And so I've, had a lot of success in, places that or with agencies that you might kind of first think of. ICE, for example, although their data tends to be extremely messy and they take a really long time. So ICE, I found some success with CBP. But I think one of the agencies that is often overlooked that I've recently I did a recent story that used data from is the EOIR, which is a part of the DOJ, and it's the agency that basically runs or oversees the immigration court system. And it is a really interesting agency because it's a court, but it's under law enforcement agency. So there's like this inherent kind of conflict of interest. And I had some success kind of getting communication between the political appointees at the DOJ on hiring decisions that they were making within the immigration court system. The immigration court system, and then the appellate body that kind of oversees the immigration court system, reviews the decisions, and sets precedent. And I think one of the things that really helped me in this particular story was after I filed the FOIA, I actually called the FOIA officer and walked through the FOIA with her, and we were able to kind of weed out the things I didn't want because it was a broad FOIA. I was looking for a lot of communications regarding hiring. And so, there's like all sorts of things that they send out, right? There's like bulletins, like, hey, we're going to have like a going away thing for a person who's leaving. Like, I didn't want any of that. So we actually walked through and weeded out all of that stuff. And that was really helpful. And I think that's one of the techniques that I've gone back to over and over again, was just to call the FOIA officer and talk it through with them. I think it really leads to much more narrow, much more precise FOIA. And, we can kind of go through it together. So that would be my big, takeaway from that experience.
Cool. Yeah. And I want to get back to kind of FOIA tips and tricks that you guys use. But Andrew, I know that you've also spent a ton of time kind of just working out agencies and the data sources. Do you have thoughts on this as well in terms of like where the data is and where to look?
Yeah, absolutely. And to build on what Tanvi was saying, which is exactly right, like I was really frustrated at multiple points in time, especially during the last administration, and we'll see how things go with this administration, with the unresponsiveness and the delays from multiple DHS agencies. And so I started to ask myself, are there other agencies that I can look to that perhaps are not under as intense scrutiny, that might be more amenable to responding to my FOIA requests? And so one place that I found a lot of success was the Department of Labor, because they intersect, right? So not only other agencies, but other agencies that intersect with immigration. So the Department of Labor, for example, plays an important role in the legal immigration system. So they have tons of data about who's filing for employment visas, when they're going out, et cetera. And all of that information you can tend to find it in one place. On the Department of Labor website, if you go through the statistics page, there's also the Department of Transportation, which has tons of data about people who are crossing the border, and it's pretty extensive. I think it goes back to the 70s or 60s. And so if you want to get a historical perspective, that's a really great place to look. And I made a list. I'm just going to rattle off a few of them without going into too much detail. I find that the Department of State actually gets pretty overlooked, but they play a super important role in the immigration system. They're the ones who are basically managing the immigration system overseas. And so I've always been really fascinated with what's happening at embassies. And I think that they do publish statistics, but I think that there's a ton of FOIA potential there as well. And the Government Services Agency, for example, they're like the human resources department for these government agencies. And so they have tons of information about hiring and pay. And like I successfully FOIA'd the Government Services Agency a few weeks ago, and they were really organized, really responsive. And they were able to tell me like basically all of the hiring practices at the USCIS, how many people have been employed, what their pay grades are, et cetera. I'm still parsing through that data. It is well organized, just the way that it's structured is a bit, difficult to navigate. And lastly, I'll say that like states, for example, if they have data portals, they sometimes tend to publish data that intersects with the experiences of immigrants in that state. So for example, Illinois, if I'm not mistaken, they publish information on like migrant or farm camps. And these are basically farms that have gotten permission to have barracks where people can sleep and eat, etc., while they're doing migrant farm labor. And like that's information that you can get from them as well. And so yeah, and so then it like opens up a whole, and like I guess the point of all this is that it really opens up a whole other universe of data that you can request, so that you're not just banging your head against the traditional immigration agencies.
Great. Yeah, that's so many great ideas, Andrew. A lot of agencies that I wouldn't necessarily think of as having immigration data. Melissa, do you want to weigh in here too about like maybe agencies other than ICE that have immigration data?
Yeah, so I have relatively limited experience here. I worked on a story pertaining specifically to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under Health and Human Services, and not pertaining at all to ICE. Yeah, with Aura Bogado. So I worked on that last fall as a follow-up to a story she had done about a young woman who had gone to immigration authorities and presented themselves and asked for asylum because of what they had experienced in Honduras. And like many children, we found thousands of children because she didn't have, this a blood relationship to the adult that she was with. For example, she was separated and was in US custody for 6 years, despite having family in the United States that could have taken care of her. So yeah, I think this was a little unusual because this pertains to children, this request. And in this case, it was actually kind of the inverse of Tanvi's experience, where Auda first tried to ask for a narrower set. And I think, maybe part of the issue is that it's dealing with children. It wound up being much more cumbersome to try to narrow it. And she found great success. But again, talking to the FOIA officer, like actually going back, wound up asking for a fuller set of the data, a benefit of which was, having a sense of the denominator. So yeah, that was that. It did culminate in a lawsuit, so it wasn't just easy, but yeah, that was one resolution.
It was a good story. And I would just add that HHS more broadly has a lot of data. HHS is the Department of Health and Human Services, and ORR, the agency that they FOIA'd, is a part of that. And they have an unaccompanied UAC, so unaccompanied alien minor program, or a children program. And so that, deals with, they have detention contract, or not detention, but facility contracts and things like that, that you can definitely FOIA. And their OIG is much more responsive as well. The only other thing I wanted to add is, Andrew talked about state governments. I also think local governments are a really good place to FOIA, like your county, city government, and like sheriff's office, because they have contracts for enforcement and for detention purposes often. And the FOIA that Anna was talking about at the beginning when she was introducing me was like an overall ICE FOIA. But you could, if you're a local reporter, you could kind of take that and then like look at your local government and see what contracts they have and what kind of, how much they get paid for detention, and how, if they've renewed the contract without sort of making that public and things like that, or if there have been complaints. I think that's a really great place. And the one other place that I would say is ICE has to publicly report any deaths in detention. And if there is a death that happened in, the place, a city or, town that you're working in, there's usually, the protocol is that you have to call in local law enforcement to do like a first, kind of like interviews with everyone to make sure that nothing is there was no foul play, etc. I mean, it's just protocol. But those tapes are really, I did a story based on a sources FOIA recently on those tapes. And that's a really great like repository of information. They often have like surveillance footage, like they just have a lot of evidence that you could use to really blow out a story about one person's experience in detention.
And actually, may I add something to that, just to say that sometimes, let's say you don't, like we can say all this, right? Like FOIA at the state level, FOIA at the local level, but you don't know where to even start. Like I tend to take a really basic approach, and it sometimes, an exploratory approach too, and it sometimes yields interesting results where I'll just start doing like Google advanced searches with terms that I know are associated with immigration at that level, right? So at the state level, local level, et cetera, putting in terms like statistics, data, reports, et cetera, and just start poking around. And that's actually how I came across the migrant camps. Like, so there's a bit of energy that needs to be put into kind of just poking in the dark. But I think it can be worth it if you don't even know where to start. And then that way it can help guide your reporting, and then you can reach out to people who have more expertise, et cetera, and then refine your searches thereafter.
Yeah, and I imagine that leads you to new ideas as well, Andrew. Melissa, do you want to expand a little bit on the challenges associated particularly with data about children? Because I know there's like kind of maybe different privacy requirements, or what was your experience with that?
Yeah, one challenge is that I mean, this is often the case with an agency, is that they won't speak to you about a particular person, and with especially regarding children. Also, children just have less of a trail online, unless you're OUTA. So OUTA was able to find individual children, and indeed, the kind of strange thing about the sequence here is that OUTA had reported deeply on the subject for years, and so could have a sense of the landscape from the perspective of particular people, so that when we got the data, a means of actually vetting the quality of the data was checking how it described people that we could identify just given what we knew about them individually. I think also tricky is that with some of the children that we were learning about, their ages were reassigned spontaneously, and it's not clear when that happens whether the person was aged up or down and what that was based on. Yeah, so there's a lot of a special kind of obscurity, but I'm sure it's universal.
So we've got a couple questions from the audience too. So how, Noelle is asking, how do you address the challenges interpreting data when it comes in without a code book or without kind of clearly defined fields and values? And I know this is something that all of you have run into. So I can pick one of you, or somebody can just jump in.
Well, I can jump in just with a recent example. And I also remember Noelle. She does really great work over at Vera. Yeah, so for example, like the story that you and I worked on, Anna, about migrant kids in CBP, like we didn't get a cookbook, documentation. I think if I'm not mistaken, you asked CBP multiple times for clarification and they didn't respond, or if they did, it was, not very useful. And so I ended up just reaching out to sources who I thought would be familiar with the system, who could help me interpret the fields based on what they know about the way that the system works or doesn't work. And that was the way that we were able to get some clarity on what information was provided to us and what it could really tell us. And I mean, beyond that, and just looking online to see if maybe there's something that might be helpful that maybe was published that they don't know was published, I can't really think of other good strategies. I mean, I really, in those cases, I really heavily rely on experts. I don't know if Tommy or Melissa, you all have other approaches.
No, that's basically it. I did the same for the ICE detention contracts database, which had a lot of, it was just very complex, and there was a lot. I had to go back to my sources like several times to be like, okay, just can you just clarify that this, this, just this column one more time, and what does it mean? I mean, like lawyers especially who work very closely in like who've done FOIAs themselves, or who's have filed lawsuits regarding whatever that topic is or that database is, would probably be my first and best like people to go to.
Yeah, I know lawyers have been really helpful for us. We contacted the Flores settlement lawyers in that story that you were talking about, Andrew, and that was really helpful. And then I also remember, I mean, this is exactly the story that I was thinking of when I saw Noelle's question, which is that you were able to track down some PDFs online that matched the summary counts exactly of the data that we had, which kind of confirmed our understanding of what that column meant. So yeah, like kind of other existing tangential documents that you can dig up online, and as Tanvi was saying, lawyers and experts, I think that all really helps. And I don't know, I mean, I didn't find CBP helpful at all when I kept bugging them for documentation, but not everybody's going to be like that. And I've definitely had experiences in other cases when I went back and asked the agency for more details or more documentation, and they were totally willing to explain it to me. So it's also worth kind of going back to the source.
I found that field officers and some of these agencies are much more helpful with like, just generally, but also with data interpretation than like HQ. So that is, obviously it doesn't work for every story, but it does. I found that as a good go-to.
Yeah, and sometimes if you send them like a sentence of your saying like, okay, I interpreted your data to mean this, they're sort of motivated to get back to you if it's wrong or something, so, or they're interested to get back to you. So that can be helpful sometimes too. Anybody else, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I'll say a group of experts that I've relied on in the past are people who tend to go to Congress to testify about conditions or inefficiencies in different parts of the system, because if they're being called in, I'm like, well, they probably know what they're talking about. And so sometimes I'll go and look at like different hearings that have been conducted and who talked or who was interrogated, and then I'll reach out to them. And they tend to be, in my experience, they've tended to be pretty willing to help me figure things out.
Actually that made me think of oversight groups. I know this is I think they're based everywhere, but in DC I've had pretty good luck with a bunch of oversight groups that are looking, they're constantly doing FOIAs to increase transparency, and some of them have been looking into immigration in particular. American Oversight is one of them. POGO, I forget their full form, but they're really helpful. So I would say like making sources at these organizations is also really helpful. They have like a number of researchers who work on FOIAs and can be really helpful in helping, just like even kind of pinning down language and helping interpret whatever data you've got.
I also, if I don't, while I'm waiting for an agency to respond to my comments, or if it feels like I can't get a response from them at all, I will sometimes encode in the scripts that I'm using to analyze the data a hypothesis about the relationship between them. So for example, in some cases, in the case of the data I was looking at, it wasn't clear what the relationship between different date fields was. So to test that, okay, this corresponds to the date they entered custody, this corresponds to the date they entered a particular facility, I wrote a script to go through the 265,000 rows and test the relationship among those variables. And And a side benefit of that is, I'm testing that I understand the relationship among the variables accurately, but also anytime there was a discrepancy, because a lot of data is manually entered and, otherwise messy. I also, wrote a script to pull out any data that did not actually fit. If something seemed inaccurate, and then built a new data set with everything that was wrong, so that when we did talk to the agency, we could ask them about particular rows, particular discrepancies.
Yeah, that's a really smart technique because, as you're saying, Melissa, you're testing that you understand the data, and then you're also identifying the potential errors. So that's a great exercise, I think, to do. I also remember when we were doing this project, the American Immigration Council, I sent them my FOIA request and talked to them about what I was trying to get. And they actually gave me feedback on the text of my FOIA request, which was amazing. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of these people can be, I just think, like super helpful because they're also really interested in getting this data out. So that can be helpful. Okay, we have a question from Joanna. Where is ICE reporting these deaths, and can you get that death data without FOIAing?
Yeah, so I'm putting in the link now. This is where they compile the reports, but they also, if you go through their press releases, sometimes they take a while to update the database. And if you go through their press releases, it's a little bit, you kind of have to do it manually, but they send out press releases for each time someone dies. So what I've often done is kind of do both, especially when it's something where the fiscal year isn't, it's like sort of just started, or there's a transition between like the time periods they sort of use to quantify. I've usually done both. I've just gone to this, and then for historical context, and then I've actually like manually counted each press release, but they should have all of them. Yeah. The other place I've gone to, sometimes they'll report deaths internally to congressional staff before they put it up publicly. And something that in my previous position at CQ Roll Call was really helpful was building, I think your district representative would want to know what's, would have an idea of what is going on in their district, or, might be getting those reports. So that might be something to check out. Also, people who are on the Homeland Security committees usually tend to get those reports as well. So if you have sources there, those are reliable for that kind of information.
And actually, oh, I'm sorry, Anna, were you going to say something?
No, go for it.
I just wanted to like throw in something that I complain about a lot, building off of what Tanvi's saying and what she's pointing to. On that same page, there's also like a little line that says like something, click here. And like that's, for example, if you click on that, it'll download, I think it's still there. Let me just double check right now. Let me do some real-time reporting. So yeah, so it says like a list of ICE's authorized detention facilities public. So actually, if you click on that and you download it, it's an Excel sheet that gets updated every so often, and it's supposed to be every month. And it has a list of what the average daily population is, what their ratings, like their standard rating is for detention standards, how many medical staff are working there. And it's just like this like weird place where they publish this really useful information on a regular basis, and you wouldn't even expect it. And I found that this happens a lot in with immigration agencies, and that's it's what happened with the situation that Anna described at CBP, where I just started plugging around in the CBP statistics, and I talked to a source, and he was like, oh, buried in there in this place you wouldn't expect is exactly the information that you're looking for. So sometimes it's even just worth sitting with these agencies' websites and like really carefully clicking through and looking at what's even there, because they make stuff publicly available in unclear, recondite ways, and you might find something that you're looking for.
Yeah, for sure. And Tanvi, I wanted to ask you about the ICE deaths. Would that also apply to deaths that might happen in CBP, or would that just be ICE?
No, I think it's just ICE, although CBP does put it out. I forget if they're congressionally mandated to put it out, but you usually do get press releases on deaths in CBP custody. It's a little bit less regular. So
Gotcha.
that has been a little bit more. I feel like there's been a lot of the reporting around deaths in CBP has been like scoops that people have got with in internal information. So there's also a lag often, even with ICE, in how much how they report these things. So yeah, I think ICE is
Gotcha.
routine.
Okay, we've got a question from Hannah about kind of the relationship between the data reporting and other types of reporting, and what does it mean for a data reporter to be a full partner in that collaboration, which is a great question that we had talked about a little bit before when we were organizing this panel. Melissa, I know that you and Auda had a really good kind of relationship and workflow system set up for that. Do you want to get us started there?
Yeah, it was, I think the most crucial thing was figuring out, I think especially when you don't work in an office together, figuring out how you like to talk. So for us, it was like any combination of, Slack messages and spreadsheets that I had made, and also just getting on the phone, just checking in once in a while to talk about it. I think I as a data reporter, I don't think I'm alone in this. I often worry that I'm just bothering the reporter if I have questions about what we're doing, or yeah, or any like topic questions, but I didn't get that sense at all working with Auda. And yeah, I guess the like getting down to brass tacks, I think one thing I did was like build our relationship into the code I was writing, so that it was, there was like I work in Jupyter Lab as an environment. And so like if she had a question for me, I would articulate that question like in the notebook, and then kind of orient like a series of questions around like, okay, so what are the premises of that question? What could I get wrong here that that doesn't quite answer it, or the like, so that like it was both like how I typically think about orienting an analysis, and also how I think about the questions she's asking, because I was really, she's very generous, and so there were some times where she said like that wouldn't have occurred to me if I had been going through this alone. So it's like a checking in with each other about yeah, what we're thinking about, or even if it doesn't seem like it's explicitly related to like the questions we already set forth, like having some room to just explore data together too. So it might sometimes just be like our scrolling through spreadsheets together on the phone.
Yeah, communication seems to be really important, and also kind of getting on the same page with like the tools that you both use and are comfortable with. Andrew, I know you've worked so much with Julia Preston, and you guys have really worked out a lot of this stuff. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, one of the things that I think has made our work relationship really successful is that I don't feel that she treats me like I'm just there to crunch numbers, that she really does think that, I'm an equal reporting partner, and we both at different points in time will do reporting and like share that and communicate, like Melissa was saying. And I think that's really key. And I, when I've worked with people who I think maybe have less experience working with data reporters, one of the ways in which I try to establish that relationship is by telling the reporter, to please share with me like any resources that they've found that have really helped them to understand the topic, so that they can see that I'm not just interested in getting the data and giving them, some sums or whatever, or some charts, that I really want to understand the system that they're looking into, the issue that they're looking into. And then exactly what Melissa said, I think is like absolutely fundamental, like building in those questions. We do that at the Marshall Project too. into our data analyses so that you can then share with the reporter. And then that also helps to establish that relationship and that there's a back and forth. Because kind of to take the last part of this question, like moments when I felt that it hasn't been successful is when the person only comes to me whenever they want to see a chart or they want to know like what the total of something is. And then they leave with that information and I have no idea what's going to happen. And it's never been catastrophic, but sometimes it'll happen that if the relationship develops that way, then you'll see the number in the story and it's not properly represented, or you need to tweak the language because there's not a full understanding of what it implies. And that's actually a disadvantage to the reporter, right? Because maybe if they had really understood what the number implied, their reporting would have been different too. And so I think making that clear, that it's important to have that feedback loop because it nourishes the reporting, can again also help to establish that relationship. And Anna, I feel like you should talk to this because you've done, I mean, so many of these, yeah, you know, co-reporting stories.
Sorry, Andrew, my audio cut out for just a second. What was the last thing that you said?
Oh, I said that I think it'd be great for you to speak to this question too, because you've
okay.
worked on so many stories this
Okay,
way.
sorry. My internet connection is unstable, so sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I feel like at the root of this question is just the idea of whether data reporters are reporters. And that's like something that a lot of newsrooms have struggled with, I think, for a long time before any of us were reporters. And obviously, like, I think all of us here feel like data reporters are reporters. And like, I personally, you know, I don't see a big difference between a data reporter and a reporter in any other kind of sense, because all we're doing is getting information, right? And whether the information happens to be in a spreadsheet or it's in a notebook or it's a bunch of quotes or it's an interview, it's all like, it's different forms of information. And so like for me, the collaborations that are successful are, I mean, it's very similar to what you were saying, Andrew, is when like the person I'm working with agrees with that. And we are both kind of coming at the project just sort of on an equal footing and as reporting partners, and we're contributing different types of things. And in that way, expanding what the project can be, because it has people who have completely different skill sets and viewpoints and can ask each other different questions. And you know, when if I'm working with someone like Julia, I'm going to learn so much from talking to her for 15 minutes, right? You know, and it's going to enrich the project because you're getting expertise from different areas. So I think you know, recently it's been easier in more and more newsrooms for data reporters to be kind of integrated at the beginning of projects and really treated like a proper reporting partner. And that's just, you know, kind of the best way to do it. I don't know. Do you guys agree? Tom, what do you think? Oh, I think you're muted.
Muted, sorry. At least one person has to do that on every panel. I don't have like coding skills and stuff. I'm not a data reporter. I have worked with data reporters, and I find that I just learned so much from just even how to think about the story and how to tailor the story and where to look and where to find information in my own reporting based on that conversation. I also feel like, you know, just even if you're not like working on a specific story together, like I found just so many story ideas in just the way that data reporters think of where to look for stuff, even before you have a topic. Like if you're just generally talking about, you know, like something broad like immigration detention, you just like, and the entry points to the story, I feel I've learned a lot from data reporters that I've worked with. And so I feel like there's really different directions and really, you know, kind of very textured and well-rounded reporting that can happen that way. And I always really get excited when I get the opportunity to work with a data reporter. I also feel so much more secure because I feel like, just the way that Melissa was talking about doing the checks about the relationships that you're kind of, the hypothesis that you've started out with. I just love working with data reporters because I'm just so insecure about, my own, like, what if I'm, had this wrong to begin with? I know that, and I've done this reporting on immigration for a really long time, but, having someone have a totally different and really secure, airtight way of like checking those, assumptions and, even thinking of assumptions. Like one of the things that I really learned in that ICE detention story was how to even frame what we're looking at, right? Like what are the assumptions that we should be informing and being really transparent about? And that was really revelatory to me because there were so many things that I hadn't thought of that were very important to point out that completely changed the way that, what the data represented. So I think, those are all the ways. Sorry, I get really excited.
Yeah, for sure. I totally second everything Tanvi said. So we have a question from Joanna about whether embassies are ever a helpful resource when reporting on immigration. I don't have any experience with that, but anybody here got any of that?
No, I think individual embassies, not so much. I think Andrew pointed out State Department's really helpful. They have more aggregate data on, what's been happening at embassies abroad that I've definitely looked at, but I haven't ever kind of tried to, get information from individual embassies. I feel like just my experience dealing with embassies on a personal level in my own immigration process, I'm a little skeptical about how much information they would offer. But yeah, I don't have a professional experience working with embassies.
So another thing that we had talked about a little bit, Melissa, you had brought up just the idea of making sure that we're still centering the human stories in our work, even when a lot of our work is like very data heavy. And a lot of what you're doing is like aggregating the experiences of a ton of people to produce a certain number or a rate or a percentage or whatever, which is super useful and it's crucial to understand what's going on. But what are some of the ways of making sure that like in all of that work we don't forget, and the reader also like doesn't miss the fact that these are real people's stories that we're talking about, and that's really why it's important.
Yeah, I think that idea is part of what drives my own records requests. Not stopping at aggregate data, because it was only possible. So I should back up. The interactive visualization we developed, both, is essentially like a dot plot showing like the distribution of kids in long-term custody over time, but also allows you, if you hover over each point, to see a narrative for each child, which really drives home the fact that each one of those points is a human. And that's only possible because we got what's called like the raw data. So whenever I'm requesting something from an agency, I want to get the data in a format that helps me to see most clearly what happened to them at each point in time. Like, can I map this data point to a moment? So it's partially asking for that data and also checking for whatever forms of the like they use to read in that data, because it helps me. It's also helpful if you don't get a data dictionary, you at least see the context in which the data was gathered. And it also just gives you a sense of, did this person have to write something down themselves, and so on. So it was always easy to hold particular things in mind partnering with Auda, because she was actually in contact with people something that she said that was really moving to me was that, you know, she wanted also a child to be able to find themselves in that data. So I think that's also crucial, is like recognizing that the people that we're reporting on are also reading this, and it helps them to feel not alone. Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge was that you want to make clear to people the magnitude of the problem. So it's like, that's 265,000 kids who need asylum, request asylum, and are detained. And it is really hard to balance conveying to people like how enormous that system is with the magnitude of the effect on one person. So that visual with the narrative that we generated from the data using Python, natural language generation, was the best way that we felt we could do that.
Yeah, I mean, those are like, I think you brought up some really important points, both on the kind of data collection and analysis end, which is the granularity of your data really matters, and like the best way you can keep the humans centered in your own mind and in the reporting is by getting the data at that level, at the person level. And then also in the way that you communicate with your reporting partner, like, again, that speaks to the value of that close collaboration, so that, you know, what Auda is doing and what you're doing, they're really kind of married and they're speaking to each other. And then in the way that you guys kind of both wrote and presented that story visually, like you kind of did it in parallel, where you were hearing stories about these kids and then you were seeing their place in a visualization. So you were putting them in the context, you were like listening to a human story, and then you were seeing that the context of all the people that similar things are happening to. So I think you guys just really were really smart about the way you thought about those issues.
Sorry to interrupt. Just like one thing that I think is really crucial here too is that when I work with a reporting partner, really this is something I think especially I learned from this last partnership. It's also to ask the supposedly non-data person what visuals they think work. I'm much more interested in what Auda would think is a good visualization for a story like this, because she knows the topic better. And that's the most crucial thing. It's like what is happening is very real to her. And so the first thing I asked was like, if we do, with whatever visual approach we have, what are things you definitely don't want to see? And what are things that you definitely do want to see? And that was crucial to have in mind from the outset.
For sure. Okay, we also have a question from Noel about race. How do we address kind of the challenges in reporting, in getting data on race and analyzing that data? That's a good question. Tanvi, maybe you can, or Andrew.
Andrew, you want to go first?
I was just going to say that it's endlessly frustrating that I've never been able to get that level of granularity. I don't even know if they collect that information, but like the most specificity on race or ethnicity that I've been able to get is just country of origin, which, you know, of course, like you don't want to go to the extent of assuming like demographics from that, but I also think that information alone can be pretty telling. And I know that like Boundless, for example, has been doing some interesting work with USCIS data, looking at country of origin of applicant to try to track like how much more or less successful some applications are depending on where they're from for different kinds of visas. And I think that even if it doesn't go to race, speak to race and ethnicity directly, it can start to give you a sense of some of the biases that we know are present in the immigration system and some of the challenges that people confront based on where they're from. And so I've been trying to, thank you for that, Tanvi. I've been trying to talk to my editor about ways in which we might be able to use country of origin to say something about systemic racism in the immigration system, because I've heard a lot from especially people who come from like Black majority countries, like about the struggles that they face in the system, as well as people from Central American countries, and how they get treated very, very differently than someone who's applying from France or someone who's applying from, you know, a Western European nation. And yeah, that's all I can really say about that, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would just add to that. That's also the primary way that I've looked at. I've had, you know, that's how they sort of code that information. And I have looked at, for example, how looked at I found some interesting trends that are worth kind of excavating within sort of more data that you might think is just very cut and dried. For example, border apprehensions. I did a story about how the number of Indians who've been crossing the border has really increased dramatically over the last 10 years. It's still, I think they're like fourth or fifth after like Central American, the three major Central American countries. It's still a much lower number comparatively, but it was like a 4,000% increase, which was crazy. So I think there are stories there that you can kind of, kind of gauge from country of origin data, which is how they usually code it. But the other thing I wanted to say was there are immigrant groups that would make good sources who look specifically at this, data by race. And so, or they, the best proxy of that. But for example, Baji, the Black, something immigrant. I'll find the. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting all the acronyms, what they stand for. But I'll put in a link in a second. They would. I think a while back they looked at bail, like who gets bail in immigration detention, and that was really interesting. How they were kind of how that differed by country of origin and race, and so. So I think there's, certain like groups will be looking at their own, the folks that they represent or that the communities that they, whose issues they talk about. And so they might be good resources to kind of understand better how you can section out that data. And I'll look for that link now and put it in.
We only have a couple minutes left now, but Andrew, do you want to just expand a little bit about what you were talking about systemic racism in the immigration kind of processing? I just thought that was kind of an interesting thread that you started there. Like how should we be thinking about that? What kind of questions can we maybe answer about that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is based on conversations that I've had with lawyers and advocates, experts, as well as people who have gone through the system. And a lot of it boils down to success rate. It's like how much more or less successful someone's application is based on their country of origin. And I think that there are a lot of questions that we can ask about, for example, like how much more or less successful you are in an asylum application if you're from a Central American country versus if you're from a Western European nation. From an African nation, and that can really just extend to, I mean, basically any part of the immigration system. Like how much more or less successful are you in court? What Tanvi just said, I hadn't thought about. That's a really fascinating question. Like how much more or less likely you are to get bail, because ultimately, like the perception of dangerousness, right, is really fundamental to immigration policy, and also coupled to that is the idea of deterrence. And there are just certain kinds of people or certain nationalities that the government is interested in deterring, and others that they're not. And I think that's reflected in the success and denial rates. There's a lot more to say about that, but that's what I had in mind when I mentioned systemic racism. I'm sure Tanvi and Melissa can speak to that more.
The only other thing I would say is I've also found some success reaching out to researchers who are looking specifically at these issues. And often I've just basically Googled like, the key terms of what I'm looking for. And, if a paper shows up, I've contacted that researcher and asked them what data set they had and like whether that can be, if it's old, do they have an updated version? And I found some success with that for stories related to race. So that would definitely be another place that's a good starting point.
Yeah. Okay. I think we could talk about that for a super long time, but I think we are out of time. So thank you guys so much for participating in this panel. I love all you guys' work. Everybody in the audience, thank you for joining us and for your really thoughtful questions. Yeah.
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you for moderating. Yeah. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.